as always, good to see you all. I'm Lee Johnson. I'll be your host for this evening. Feel free to interrupt at any point, ask for clarification, ask a question, make a comment. All of that is welcome. If you don't want to voice it, then please just put it in the chat and we'll try to take it up as we have a moment to do so. And so I'll start by reminding myself and all of us that the land on which my office is located and the offices of the church, for thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of many other peoples, such as the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, Mississaugas of the Credit, and today the land is still home to many indigenous people across Turtle Island. I articulate, again, the church's commitment to healing, truth, and reconciliation. And hello, Kathy, welcome. So we'll just, let me recap quickly. Part of what we're doing here is responding to Gager's work, where he says that Paul, as the father of Christian anti-Judaism, is a misguided conception. He cites these points that he's heard often, and I've heard as well, that Paul converted from Judaism to Christianity, that he repudiated Judaism once he converted, that he said that God has now rejected Jews as God's people, and he said that Paul believed and taught Christ as the only means to be God's people. So those are the points, key points at which Gager has said he argues with all of this perspective, and that the evidence inside the New Testament and outside the New Testament doesn't read this way. He does acknowledge that there are some places in the New Testament that read more this direction, but that shouldn't be read back onto Paul's views. So tonight we look at Galatians, one of the sources of some of this talk about Paul. And so a little bit of background. Galatians, by the majority of biblical scholars, is dated kind of early in Paul's letter writing. So Paul's mission and travels began in earnest around 48. The first letter of Paul's is probably 1 Thessalonians, written about 50. Galatians is going to follow, according to most people's ideas. Galatians is going to follow shortly after that. And so here's generally how Paul's mission routine worked. So he would establish himself within a community. He said that he self-supported, so he worked probably in a tent-making shop. He probably did some of his preaching and teaching as he worked with these hides in this unsavory position. He spent months at a place. He organized a community of faith around him. He was one who understood that he was called and sent to the Gentiles. So he knows that other people are, such as Peter, have been called to preach to the Jews, but he is one sent directly to the Gentiles. So when he goes into the community, he seeks out people that would be already interested in Judaism. And I described these people to you. One of the names for these kinds of people would be God-fearers, the righteous Gentiles who are interested in Judaism, probably have ties to the Jewish community, may participate in some of the Jewish traditions and festivals, may have adopted some of the Jewish dietary restrictions, but they haven't become full converts to Judaism. So these Gentiles, we know, were a source of interest and participation within Judaism for centuries. They were discussed quite a bit in Jewish writings and teachings. What do we make of the righteous Gentiles? Where do they fit into the scheme of things? And it's clear that they're a point of contention and concern for Jews. What do we do with this group of people who behave righteously, who are, perhaps more devoted than some people who are Jewish? What do we make of them? Are we willing to say they aren't fully God's people? What do we do about them? So there's been centuries of talk about this particular thing before Paul comes on the scene. But it's clear that this type of person would be very interested, perhaps, in what Paul has to say. So Paul goes, establishes himself in the community, persuades people, Gentiles, that they can be part of God's people, not through conversion, which has been what's been taught to them, but now there is a new way through Christ that they become God's people. And that's Paul's message of good news to them. That's part of the way that they become part of Paul's church, is that they accept this message. And the entree point for them is baptism. And so when Paul is writing to the Galatians, there's a point at which he reminds them of their baptism. And so baptism is the means by which they accept what Christ has done, and they become God's people. And this is Paul's message to them. So he establishes this group. He doesn't pay much attention, it seems. Paul doesn't pay much attention to the organization of these people. He doesn't establish, bylaws, and he doesn't have lots of regulations. In fact, I think because Paul says for these people, they are not, the law isn't for them. The law was never meant to be for them. That Paul's trying to avoid setting up another system of regulations. And so he leaves it seemingly pretty loose. There's not anybody really to go to if they have a question or a problem. And I think part of that is Paul's resistance to the law is not for these Gentiles. That's clearly something that he believes. But it's also Paul's thought that the return of Jesus, the parousia, was going to be soon. So the parousia means the coming or the presence. And so Paul clearly instilled this in his communities. In fact, when I said First Thessalonians was one of the earliest letters, probably the earliest letter, one of the things that Paul writes to them, because Paul's usually writing out of some concern that he has heard or they've sent a question to him. The question that comes from the Thessalonians is, what do we do about these people, these beloved ones in our community who have died? And where are they going to be? How are they going to fit in when the parousia happens? Where is their place? And so it's clear that Paul laid this expectation into the foundation of his communities. His church people believed it. Paul himself believed it. And so I think Paul didn't imagine there was any need for lots of hierarchy and, rule making and so on. So that's the scene that's set. And then the next thing that happens that we know of is that other people come to this community and they undercut what Paul has taught them. And so they do this in a couple of ways. First, they cast doubt on Paul's authority. This guy isn't legit. This guy isn't really an apostle. And then second, they go after the message itself. And so you see this in the way that Paul writes to the Galatians. He knows that these people have come. He knows that his message is being, and himself, both of them being denigrated. And he also is aware that the Galatians are so persuaded by these opponents of Paul's that they're being convinced that they should undergo circumcision to gain status as God's people. And so Paul has heard all of this, and Paul then writes this letter and sends it with an envoy and is dealing with this particular issue. So we have to read what's written in Galatians. First of all, it's written to Gentiles who have been brought together under Paul's teachings, Gentiles who are now have someone else in their ear telling them that Paul's all wrong and that Paul is not legit, and that it's a very tense situation. And so Paul probably, by the time he hears about what's going on in Galatia, he gets someone together with him to write a letter. Then he gets probably that same person to take that letter across land to Galatia and deliver it to them. That can be a couple of weeks. And it's clear that he's not sure what's going on, but he's doing his best to try to persuade them through this letter and through this person who delivers the letter that they shouldn't listen to these people who are troubling them. All right, let me pause there. Do you understand the background and the stage that's set for this letter? Is there anything you want to ask? Okay, so let me say just a little bit more about the way that Jews talked about the Gentiles and thought about the Gentiles and thought about the law. So I don't know if you grew up with this, but I heard, that the law is just a bunch of legalistic minutia that doesn't really matter, that people had gotten caught up in being so faithful to the law, they've forgotten what really mattered. I mean, that's the kind of impression that I grew up with reading the Bible and people teaching me about the Bible. But really, even though the details of following the law are certainly there, the Jews did then and still do look at the law as a gift from God, a special gift from God, something that liberates them and defines them. And so following the law is a way of showing devotion to God, but following the law is not seen as a way to gain righteousness. And so if we talk about the law as a means to gain righteousness, that's not the way the Jews talked about it. Now, Paul gets into this, but we have to remind ourselves that he's talking to Gentiles and he's not talking to Jews here. So Paul really goes after the law because he's pretty adamant that these Gentiles, the law was not made for them. And they really ought not to follow it. And particularly the issue of circumcision, which is really usually that final step to full conversion into Judaism, that they should not under any circumstances be circumcised. And so the Jews thought of, they just kind of called the rest of the people, the nations, and that we translate it as Gentiles, but they talked about them, and sometimes they use this language, and Paul, I think, refers to it here too, but just call the rest of the people sinners. And that, I don't think we'd ever do that. I hope we wouldn't. But that kind of language, you see it in the writings too. And it's not so much thought of as a morality, but it's someone who's on the outside. And that they, as I said, the law was a gift to them, but they thought that a Gentile trying to adhere to the law would find it an unbearable burden. And that and that's because it really was never intended to be for them. And so this is an age-old question about what do we do with these righteous Gentiles? And that some of them, despite this generalization that the law was not for them, some of them were devoting themselves to following the law. But one of the ways in which the Jewish people had said, here's a way of thinking about what the righteous Gentiles do, is that they have a law unto themselves. And that part of that law is called the laws related to the Noah era. Before Moses brought the laws to the people, there were 7 basic Noahic laws, and that righteous Gentiles may adhere to those. So anyway, enough of the background. Paul sees the risen Christ, and he determines from that vision. Remember, up to this point, he's been against Jesus' followers, but once he sees that vision and understands that Jesus is resurrected, now Jesus is the risen Christ, that Paul interprets the time that he's living in as the last days. And so let me share this passage from Joel with you. I might have even shown you this before. But this passage from Joel, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female slaves in those last days, I will pour out my spirit. And that, people believe, is part of what drives Paul in his understanding of who Jesus is. Because Paul also presents himself as one who has received this spirit. He talks about presenting himself not as one who's eloquent, but as one who demonstrates the spirit and the power. And it seems that that same sense of the spirit coming upon happens to the communities that he brings together. And that's one of the persuasive things about Paul's messages, that his followers have this same sense of the spirit. You might remember in Corinth, this became quite an issue because the Corinthians seemed particularly adept at the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues, so much so that they seem to have valued this above any of the other things that might be a manifestation of the Spirit. And Paul had to tell them they were too enthusiastic about it, to walk back how important it was. But it seems that it certainly was something that was experienced in Galatia. So let's see here. I think he mentions it in chapter 3. Yeah, where he says, did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Having started with the Spirit, are you now ending with the flesh? So they seem to have this same sense of the Spirit is the persuasive point of they are indeed God's people because the Spirit has fallen upon them. So here is this community, and now they're hearing the alternative side of things when this other group arrives. And sometimes these guys get called the Judaizers. We don't really use that term. That's not really in the New Testament. Sometimes they get called the circumcision party, which sounds like a very bad party. And so I think that's a weird way of describing them too. But I would just say, they're Paul opponents. They're the ones who, and I wouldn't think of them as, just being antagonistic. I think that they were just like Paul used to be on the other side of this thing. They were persuaded that their understanding of things was the right way to think, and that Paul's vision of Gentile inclusion was an aberration that Judaism was not and should not accept. And so what you have then, so Paul's there, he leaves, this other group of people, it sounds like there were more than one, come to Galatia. Perhaps they'd heard that there was this group of Gentiles that were claiming to be part of God's people, and they came to, disabuse them of this idea that they thought was wrong. And I think they had the easier time of making this argument, because the first thing that they do is they go after Paul's authority. And this is a rather easy case to make, I think, because most of the leaders of the early Jesus movement, they were people who had been Jesus disciples, part of Jesus' family, some of Jesus' inner circle. It seems like those were the ones. And who was Paul? He was nowhere in the picture. And once Paul does understand something about Jesus, he's against him. And so Paul doesn't have any of the traditional credentials. The line of power and the distribution of power is called the apostolic succession. And so there's the sense where Jesus passes on authority to these people, these ones that he's chosen. And then those in that group then pass it along to the next group. And the Catholic papal tradition still follows this line of apostolic succession, that each one of these selected people can trace back through the generations, comes from this person, this person, this person, so on. So the apostolic succession does not belong to Paul. And Paul doesn't seem to have ever heard or met Jesus. Have you noticed Paul never quotes Jesus? There's lots of places in Paul's letter and argument that I think, oh, this would have been the time, if he knew the story of this and that, this would have been the time for him to bring it up. He does not. And so Paul's message isn't packed with Jesus sayings or remembrances of Jesus. He doesn't have any of that. And he says he's not very eloquent. So his authority comes from a different place. And so let's see what he does with this authority issue. It's the first thing that he brings up basically in this letter. And it's clear to me that this is one of the things that his opponents are going after. He even has the way he starts this, Paul, an apostle, sent by neither human commission nor from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ. He starts with that very, strong affirmation of his authority. And then he says, here's his credentials. And he talks about his, past in Judaism. And then the one who had set me apart before I was born called me through his grace, pleased to reveal his son to me, that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. I did not confer with any human, nor did I go up to Jerusalem, but I went into Arabia. And then he goes up to Jerusalem and he visits, Peter for 15 days, didn't see anyone else. And he stays away for 14 more years and finally goes up to Jerusalem, and they confirm that he was indeed selected by God to go to the Gentiles. And so he's saying, I have this authority. And in fact, he's saying it, mine's really better than theirs because I didn't get it from a person. It came straight from a revelation from God. So, you guys who are saying you have better credentials, I don't think you can top this. So that was, that's his response to, Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. But the next thing is about the message itself. And so here's where the argument gets difficult. So Paul is working against, centuries of tradition, centuries of a religious set of teachings, centuries of religious practice. And he's saying, now, through the advent of Jesus, Gentiles come into God's family through Christ. And it's not through the works of the law. It's not through he talks about the flesh a lot, and he's referencing it's not through this act of circumcision. You came through a different pathway. And I have to think that the people that came after Paul with this other message saying, no, we know, and you know how this works. We have our set of laws given to us by God through Moses. This is our sacred tradition. This is our ways of maintaining our relationship with God. These laws are sacred. And we are God's called select people, and circumcision is one of the marks of that selection. And so all of you that were told that, simply by that baptismal ritual, which is related to Jewish tradition, you probably heard of those, purification rituals related to Judaism, that one of the things that they often find, and that they know that is their archaeology is turning up a Jewish site, is the mikveh, the immersion bath built in, where these purification rituals can take place. And so the notion of water and immersion is certainly part of Jewish tradition. And so that becomes, for them to say, well, you can't just say this is your means for entering into this, sacred relationship with God. We know how it works. The pathway's there. It's always been there. This recent fly-by-night message cannot erase what we've all known for centuries. And so it's clear that message, and part of who they reference undoubtedly was Abraham, because when Paul starts to refute what they're saying, he makes an argument, albeit a troubled one, related to Abraham. And, they say, we can trace our heritage all the way back to Abraham. So you can't say that this character that just talked to you can go against what we know all the way back to our father Abraham. So it's undoubtedly, and they might have thrown in, this is far too easy. It's too good to be true. It's too simple. But this is the voice that's, the other side of Paul's voice in there. This is the other voice going, oh, yeah, maybe that wasn't right. Maybe Paul wasn't legit. You got a good point here. So this is the circumstances under which Paul is writing to them. So here's the message. The opponents say God's covenant stands. It's a covenant. It's always been this way. It always should be this way. Conversion to Judaism is definitely possible. You know how it works. The regulations and the pathways have been there forever. This is the way it has to be. And for you to say anything different is to, ignore centuries of what we know it to be true. And so Paul takes on his legitimacy. Reminds me, I was at this conference, and this person gave a paper, and it was related somewhat to this topic. And the title of the paper was, "I'm an apostle, darn it." And they were talking about Paul's writings, and his voice. And I would say that's pretty legit, except Paul would have probably said something more than darn. But he in this situation, you see his anger and his, deep concern, and his real sense of that time is running away from him on this. And so some of the stuff that he says are pretty, he resorts to name calling, shall we say. So let's see some of the stuff that he says here. If an angel from heaven shall proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. And then it says it again, something like that in verse 9. If anyone proclaims you a gospel contrary to what you receive, let that one be accursed. Let that one be accursed probably translates more accurately to damn them. And so Paul's saying this twice. And actually, I have to remind myself, Paul isn't saying that to them. Paul's sending someone else to say that to them. And someone is saying, in front of this community, is saying these very harsh comments. Something else that he does here that's kind of interesting. Here he says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? I mean, he's describing them as someone who's fallen under a curse. And so it also implies that they're really gullible, that they're the way that they talked about it is that your orifices were weak and susceptible to invasion. And that's what he's saying. Someone has invaded you. And how weak are you to allow this to happen? He also says something else. Here's where he's talking about his opponents again. He's damned them earlier, but here he says, I wish those who unsettle you would castrate themselves. Once again, I mean, and there's some whimsy in this as well as, vitriol, is because he's talking about them trying to convince these people to undergo circumcision. And so he's saying, I wish they would do that to themselves. But it's even funnier in the Greek because the word for circumcision it's a word to cut, and the prefix is peri, which means cut around, peritome. And this one, he still uses tome, but he says katatome, which means cut down. And so he's saying, I wish they would, instead of peritome, I wish they would katatome. I wish they would cut their own members off. So these are pretty strident words that Paul is making someone else say on his behalf. But it just tells you, the urgency that he feels about this. And so there's a couple of things that you might ask, which is, or maybe let me pause and say, do you want to ask something before I pose the questions for you? Anything you want to ask? Well, he's adamant that they are not to follow the laws. He's adamant that they are not to, under any circumstances, undergo circumcision. But I think it's because he thinks with the advent of Christ, that Christ has made this way for the Gentiles to be included in God's people, that if they do this, they are turning their back on the gift of God through Christ to them. And so he is saying, you're going to cut yourself off. And I think he uses that language too. He's going to cut yourself off from the gift that Christ has given you. All right, so here's some of his argumentation. And this is where the challenge comes for reading Paul as, who is he writing to and why is he saying that? All right. So like I said, I believe Abraham was one of the patriarchs invoked by Paul's opponents. So, we trace our lineage back to Abraham. We are people of Abraham. And so here's Paul's basic argument. And I know some of you have said, Paul is so hard to understand. And part of it is because he's making some challenging arguments. The Abraham one, there's some logic to it. But what he says is, okay, so Abraham was before the advent of the law, before Moses. Abraham was well before it. And it says that God reckons Abraham as righteous because Abraham believed God. And so Paul seizes upon Abraham as believing, because he says that's what the Gentiles have to do, is believe, and that that Abraham was promised that all the Gentiles will be blessed. And so he's saying, okay, here's the promise to Abraham coming now to you. So here it is. This is happening. And so he writes about who, if you rely on the works of the law, you're under a curse. This is the part that people quote a lot, saying that Paul thinks the law is, not legitimate anymore, that he's turned his back on the law. But he's talking about, when he says all, he's talking about all these people who have been brought in through Christ. If you're trying to rely upon the law for righteousness, you're going to fail. And I already said that they think that, the law was not ever really meant for Gentiles. And so Paul is definitely pushing that point. No one's reckoned as righteous before God by the law. All right, so that's not going to be your way. Whoever does the works of the law will live by them. Christ redeemed us, the Gentiles, from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. In Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles. So all of this is written to these people who are on, the precipice of ignoring what Paul has taught them. All right. And so what Paul goes on with Abraham is, it says the promises were made to Abraham and his offspring. It doesn't say offsprings, but one. And that one is Christ. Now, here's where the argument, I think, gets iffy. But my point is this: the law came later. It doesn't annul that covenant, but it comes through the promise that God gave to Abraham. All right. And so the law then is here because of transgressions. In other words, Paul's seeing the law as sort of a guiding point for people who are outside of, God's people. All right. So it goes on. Is the law opposed to the promises of God? No. And here comes a very significant phrase, that the faith of Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. So there's a little footnote here, and your translation may say faith in Jesus Christ, but that little preposition makes a huge difference in the way that you think about this passage. Because if it's the faith or the faithful actions or the faithful deeds of Jesus, then it's Jesus' submission to the cross, that Jesus' death, that brings those close. It's not their act of believing in Jesus that makes it happen. It's Jesus' faithful action that brings things about. So it says that faith has come, meaning Jesus' faithful action. We are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. We Gentiles, he always talks about himself with his communities. We Gentiles are not subject to this law, which was never really meant for us. In Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. And that faith means Jesus' faithful action. And then here's the baptismal formula that people think, because it appears 3 different times in Paul's letters, or at least in 2 of the letters, and then 1 possible letter of Paul. There's no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There's no longer male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Since this formula appears several times, it's believed that this is what was said at the baptism. This was part of the ceremony. And he says it here. It's you're baptized into Christ. All right, so that's Paul's point to the Gentiles about Abraham. And then he goes on, he talks about, and this is where I think his argument has become strained, but it says here, let's see. All right, yeah. In further in this chapter, it says there are 2 children. There's Sarah, there are 2 wives of Abraham. There's Sarah and there's Hagar. Each had a child. One is a child of enslaved woman. That is a fleshly child. And the other, the child of the free woman, born through promise. And he says, these women are like 2 covenants. One is Hagar from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. And then the other is, the other woman corresponds to Jerusalem and corresponds to free people. But here's the bizarre part, is that Paul says, you Gentiles are the free children. And so even though the Jewish lineage traces through the sons of Abraham and Sarah, Paul has the audacity to say, you people are really from that lineage. So I'm not sure how persuasive this argument would be, because Paul's tried to turn it on its head, saying it's allegory. But I can just imagine if the Galatians tried to, recite this back to the opponents of Paul, they might not find that the least bit persuasive. But Paul says, he said they're the children of the children of the inheritance of the lineage of the free. And he says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. Do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And so he's making this plea. And, you have to realize that some of the people that are hearing this, they are slaves. They're actually slaves. We know that there were a lot of slaves in the early movement. And so Paul is telling them, or having his envoy say, don't become a slave again. And so it's just, it's a troublesome argument. Most people, I think I told you this, most people do not think that Paul's argument won the day in Galatia. The reason is that after this letter, we don't hear of this church anymore. Paul writes letters related to people in his churches providing money for an offering that's going to be taken to Jerusalem. And he mentions several places, and he does not bring up the Galatians there. And because it just goes quiet after this, people think that Paul's group faded off, that they were persuaded that Paul didn't know what he was talking about, that they were being led astray by Paul, and that, they should return to their position as God-fearers or actually undergo the ritual of circumcision so they could be, fully integrated into the people of God. So Paul's message is, a kind of a convoluted argument. First of all, yes, I am authoritative. Yes, I do have credentials, not the traditional credentials, but the credentials that are perhaps better. A special revelation from Christ has brought this to you. And then here's why you shouldn't undergo circumcision, because it really wasn't meant for you. And if you do that, it's like you're adopting the flesh when you have the spirit. And everybody knows the spirit's better than the flesh. And so focusing upon circumcision, Paul turns into an obsession with the flesh. So he says, those who want to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. People don't know what persecuted for the cross of Christ means, but it's clear that there is a battle going on for how to think about this issue and where does Jesus fit into this whole thing. But he says their motive is just to be able to boast about your flesh. Were these people really keeping track of how many people they persuaded to be circumcised? Maybe, I don't know, but that's seemingly what he implies there. But he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything. So that's his argument. And the problem with this is Paul's writing in the heat of a conflict over these people's, lives, is the way he sees it. Paul is writing to a very specific moment and a very specific issue. And he is being pretty strident against these voices that go against what he says. And he's lashing out at the Galatians themselves for not being loyal to his message. But if you take any of these writings and turn them into a universal picture of Paul's thoughts on the law, if you lift any of these passages out of a context of these are directed at these Gentile recruits, the Gentiles that he brought together as a church through Jesus, these Gentiles that he had baptized through the faithfulness of Jesus, into the people of God. If you look at it any different way, if you think of this as a universal discussion of Paul's thoughts on the law, then you are going to have a skewed perspective of what Paul was thinking. And that's happened a lot. If you read the passages that says, the law is nothing. The law leads to slavery. The law does not lead to righteousness. Any of those things that he said in that context, if you lift those up, it looks like Paul is anti-Jewish. It looks like Paul is anti-covenant and anti-law. And so looking at any of these passages out of context in Galatia presents a pretty dim view of Paul and Judaism. And that's what we've seen historically, that people lift these passages and say, look here, how can you read this and say, this doesn't mean universally Paul rejected the law? Okay. Questions, things you want to bring up? Well, part of what we do, and when we, I've told you this, reading these letters, it's like listening into half of a conversation between people that you don't know and trying to figure out what they mean and think. And so that's usually harmless activity, but when you take sacred writings, I mean, Paul never thought his letters were going to be bound into a volume that was called a Bible. But if you take these writings and you pay no attention to the context and apply them universally across dates, times, cultures, without thinking, what is the context within which these words were said? It's a risky proposition. And some pretty horrendous things have ensued based in part upon this kind of treatment of Paul's letters. And, Paul's a prickly character, and there's a lot to dislike about him. But I don't think this is one of those things. I think his, vitriol perhaps might have been well placed. I think him making someone else say those remarks on his behalf was probably pretty rough. I wonder if, we think it might have been Titus that delivered this. I wonder if Titus did say it just like that, or if Titus softened it up a little bit for the people. But it would be very hard, depending on who's there when the letter is presented, to say those things with the kind of vehemence that Paul meant them. It would be pretty difficult, I think. So Ian, please have a comment.
Just want to go back to something you said earlier this evening. You talked about how there's very, very little in Paul that quotes Jesus or recounts or references some of the stories that we're so familiar with. And could you just talk a little bit about why that might be?
Yeah, well, of course, nothing was written down that we know of. Paul's time from, probably his vision was about 33 or 35, somewhere in there. Paul has died by 63, something like that. The earliest written things that we know is 70, that were, the gospel writings as we have them. So people were certainly circulating these stories about Jesus, and Paul may have heard them, but when he was hearing them, he was adamantly against, he's immediately offended, and so he probably wasn't trying to commit any of this stuff to memory about stuff that he's hearing. But I think it's probably likely that he didn't know a lot of it, that we don't know the extent of his, his vision, his revelation, what he, and I think he goes away after he has that vision, and that might be the time when he starts to accrue some information about it. But I think Paul wanted to really rely upon that special vision as his understanding of things. And he also, maybe he was a little worried about, if I start quoting Jesus, then I'm going to establish a new set of laws and teachings here, that he wasn't interested in doing that. He was trying to do the opposite. Let's not have, for the Gentiles, there's not the regulations, there's not the teachings. We're not even worried if they know any of this stuff. This is what we're going to focus on now. So I think it's a combination of, he didn't know some of the stuff, to he wanted to focus elsewhere. But we don't know. I mean, but I think it's very likely that he never heard Jesus say one word in his teaching time, that Paul wasn't involved in that. He never saw it. And he says he didn't confer with the people in Jerusalem, so he wasn't getting anything straight from the disciples' mouths. He didn't seem to want that. Do you guys feel like it's understandable why Paul would have, by Paul's community would have been persuaded otherwise? There must have been something dynamic about Paul, and there were certainly things that he did that were persuasive. But once he's gone, and the regular people come in with the more typical stories, with the more typical credentials, I think it's easy to understand how these Gentiles could start to wonder, I don't know.
I always find with Paul, when you read it, you think he always says, like, he's so humble, he's so humble. I said, no, he's not. I mean, he puts on that, I'm a humble guy.
Oh yeah, well,
voice of the people kind of thing. But I must say, reading the Galatians, I mean, I've read Galatians dozens of times. And after your study, I've picked up all kinds of stuff I never really noticed before. That's what I really liked. I really enjoyed that, because I don't remember reading that. Yeah. So thank you.
That's a great compliment. Thank you. I'm glad that's the case. I mean, but I think any piece, be it musical or an art piece or any bit of literature that is in fact profound, that should be your reaction, that you should be able to see more every single time. And it may take some it may take some prodding from somewhere else to get you to see that. But yeah, I think anything that's worth our second, third, fourth, fifth look has more to it than initially meets the eye. So there was some comment, but I missed it. It went away. Let me see if I can bring it up here.
The question was, do we know how firmly Paul's messengers agreed?
Oh, you mean the people that delivered his letters? Or is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Yeah. I think they must have been devoted. I think they were. And it seems like that they were persuaded by Paul as well. And I have to feel like that they had experienced these spiritual outpouring, just like Paul's communities. So I think that they were quite persuaded and quite devoted to Paul's message, and were willing to really sacrifice for this message of Paul's. It looks like most of them were Gentile converts, I guess is a good word for them. So yeah, I think that they were persuaded, and they'd probably seen an awful lot by this time. So I can't imagine them going through the hardships with Paul that they must have done without being committed to it. Kathy, please go ahead.
I'm really thrilled that I took part in this study, because it's always bothered me, when Jesus preached love and all this type of stuff, the hatred of Jews that seem to come through, and some of the older people in my childhood congregation kind of felt that too. So it's nice to see it balanced, to learn the context. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And he comes to his faith completely different from all the other ones. None of the other ones were struck down.
No.
Yeah. So of course he's going to have a very different take on things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And he's just such a character. I mean, he's just rabid in whatever he's doing. He's so devoted, and he's so persuaded that he's right. And but he suffers for it. There's no doubt about it. He suffers, and he had an uphill climb on this one to go against traditions, and he knows them well. He says he's a Pharisee. I think that's true. And so that means that he knows how to interpret the law, and he knows the law. And so he understands, in light of all of that this is something else. This is something new that's happening. And that he feels this incredible weight of the call to go to the Gentiles. And it's clear he's not the only one, because when we get next week to the letter to the Romans, that's a community that Paul did not found. And someone else had gathered them together under this same notion. And so Paul was one of a group of people that was interpreting things through Jesus' death and resurrection as relating to these last days where the Gentiles would be pulled in and all brought in to God's people. And so he's got this optimistic view and message, but he's like this character where these people are nagging at him from behind wherever he goes. They're constantly dogging him about his authority, his legitimacy. They're calling him names, and then he's calling him names back. And so he wishes that they would castrate themselves. That's a nice gift to hope for your opponents.
Whoever says the Bible's boring.
Oh yeah, well, it gets translated boring sometimes. The translations help with the boringness, and I think Paul gets washed out quite a bit with the translation. So yeah, the fact that one, the new NRSV has the "I wish they would castrate themselves," that is, if you look at older translations, you're not going to see the word castrate there. No. So somebody's trying to give Paul his legitimacy, his due there.
I have to go to my next meeting, but thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for joining.
Take care.
All right. Any last words of wisdom? Next week, Romans. It just gets more complicated. Okay. Well, have a great week, everyone. Thanks for joining.